What happens when a 12-year-old black student walks into an advanced mechanical engineering class and gets challenged to fix an engine that has stumped graduate students for months? Professor Helena Richardson looked at Marcus Johnson with a smirk that could cut glass. "Since you seem to know so much about engines, young man, why don't you show us how it's done?" she said, pointing to the seized experimental engine in the corner. 10 minutes. That's all you get." The entire class held their breath as Marcus quietly rolled up his sleeves. What happened next would change everything they thought they knew about genius, judgment, and the power of underestimating someone. Dear viewer, if you are watching my story for the first time, I humbly request you write the location from where you are watching right now, subscribe this channel and press the bell icon now not to miss the notifications of my daily published new stories. Thank you, and let's dive into the full story. The heavy wooden door of classroom 304 creaked open, and 12-year-old Marcus Johnson stepped inside, his worn sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. The advanced mechanical engineering classroom fell silent as 30 pairs of eyes turned to study the newcomer. Marcus clutched his weathered backpack tighter, feeling the weight of their stares like a physical force pressing against his small frame. Professor Helena Richardson looked up from her lecture notes, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the fluorescent light. Her blue eyes narrowed as she took in Marcus's appearance, his too large hand-me-down clothes, his cautious posture, and most notably, his age. At 51, she had been teaching mechanical engineering for over 2 decades, and she had never seen a student quite like this one. "Excuse me," Professor Richardson said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I think you might be lost, young man. The elementary school is 3 blocks down the street." A few students snickered, but most remained silent, sensing the tension in the room. Marcus straightened his shoulders, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "I'm Marcus Johnson, ma'am. I'm supposed to be in this class. I have my acceptance letter right here." He reached into his backpack and pulled out a slightly crumpled piece of paper. Professor Richardson's eyebrows rose skeptically as she walked over, her high heels clicking against the floor. She snatched the letter from Marcus's hands and scanned it quickly. Her expression shifted from dismissive to barely concealed annoyance. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "it appears the university's diversity program has reached new heights. Or should I say, new lows." The classroom atmosphere grew thick with discomfort. Some students shifted in their seats, while others whispered among themselves. Marcus felt his cheeks burn, but he kept his head high. He had faced worse than this before. "Take a seat anywhere you can find one," Professor Richardson said, waving her hand dismissively. "Try to keep up, though I suspect that might be challenging for someone of your background." She returned to the front of the class, her smile sharp and cold. Marcus found an empty seat in the back corner, ignoring the curious and sometimes hostile glances from his classmates. As he settled in, he could hear fragments of whispered conversations. "How old is he? What's a kid doing here? This is going to be interesting." One student, a girl with kind eyes named Sarah, leaned over and whispered, "Don't let her get to you. She's tough on everyone." Marcus nodded gratefully, appreciating the small gesture of kindness in what felt like a hostile environment. Professor Richardson cleared her throat loudly, demanding attention. "Now that we've dealt with our interruption, let's continue with today's lesson on internal combustion engines. I trust everyone has reviewed the assigned reading on thermodynamic cycles." Her gaze swept the room, lingering pointedly on Marcus. Marcus opened his notebook, a simple composition book that looked shabby compared to the expensive laptops and tablets his classmates used. But his mind was sharp and ready. He had been preparing for this opportunity his entire life, even if he didn't look like he belonged here. The professor began drawing complex diagrams on the whiteboard, her explanations filled with technical jargon and theoretical concepts. Marcus followed along easily, his hand moving quickly as he took detailed notes. He had learned much of this material already, not from textbooks, but from countless hours spent in his Uncle Jerome's auto repair shop. The auto cycle, Professor Richardson explained, consists of 4 distinct phases: intake, compression, combustion, and exhaust. The efficiency of this cycle depends on various factors including compression ratio, fuel quality, and engine design. She paused, scanning the room. Can anyone tell me what the primary limitation of the Otto cycle is? Several hands shot up, but Professor Richardson's eyes landed on Marcus. A cruel smile played at the corners of her mouth. Mr. Johnson, since you're taking such diligent notes, perhaps you'd like to enlighten us? Marcus felt every eye in the room turn to him. He could sense the expectation of failure, the assumption that he would stumble and prove that he didn't belong. But he also felt something else, a quiet confidence that came from real understanding, not just memorized facts. The primary limitation is knock, Marcus said clearly. When the compression ratio gets too high, the fuel-air mixture ignites spontaneously before the spark plug fires, causing engine knock. This limits how much you can compress the mixture, which limits efficiency. The room fell silent. Professor Richardson's smile faltered slightly, clearly not expecting such a precise answer. That's correct, she said, her tone suggesting she was disappointed he hadn't failed. Though I'm curious where a 12-year-old would learn such terminology. Marcus met her gaze steadily. Books, ma'am. And experience. Experience? Professor Richardson's laugh was sharp and mocking. What kind of experience could you possibly have? Playing with toy cars? The class erupted in nervous laughter, but Marcus didn't flinch. I've been working on engines since I was 8, Marcus replied calmly. Real engines. Cars, trucks, motorcycles. My uncle owns a repair shop, and he's been teaching me everything he knows. Professor Richardson's expression hardened. Well, Mr. Johnson, I hate to break it to you, but changing oil and replacing spark plugs hardly qualifies as engineering experience. What we study here is advanced theoretical mechanical engineering, not backyard mechanics. The word stung, but Marcus had heard similar dismissals before. He knew that in the eyes of many people, practical knowledge was somehow less valuable than academic theory. But he also knew something that Professor Richardson didn't. Sometimes the most important learning happened with your hands dirty and your mind open to possibilities. Now, Professor Richardson continued, turning back to the board, let's discuss the mathematical relationships that govern engine performance. These equations are quite complex, so I don't expect everyone to grasp them immediately. Her eyes flicked to Marcus meaningfully. As the class continued, Marcus found himself increasingly frustrated. The professor's explanations were technically correct but missed the practical nuances that made engines actually work. When she described valve timing, she ignored the real-world factors that mechanics dealt with every day. When she talked about fuel injection, she glossed over the diagnostic challenges that required intuition and experience to solve. Marcus raised his hand tentatively. Professor Richardson, what about variable valve timing? Doesn't that change how we calculate optimal performance? The professor's jaw tightened. Mr. Johnson, we're covering basic principles here. Advanced topics like VVT are beyond the scope of this introductory discussion. Please try to focus on the material we're actually covering. But Marcus pressed on, his passion for the subject overriding his caution. I understand the basics, but in practice, most modern engines use some form of variable timing. Shouldn't we be learning how that affects the Otto cycle calculations? Professor Richardson's face flushed red. Mr. Johnson, I've been teaching mechanical engineering for 23 years. I think I know what material is appropriate for my students. Your job is to listen and learn, not to question my curriculum. The classroom fell silent again, but this time the tension was different. Some students looked uncomfortable with the professor's harsh response, while others seemed to enjoy the confrontation. Marcus felt his face burn with embarrassment, but also with anger. He wasn't trying to be disruptive, he genuinely wanted to learn and contribute to the discussion. Yes, ma'am, Marcus said quietly, sinking back into his seat. Professor Richardson smiled triumphantly. Good. Now, as I was saying, the theoretical maximum efficiency of the Otto cycle can be calculated using the following formula. She turned back to the board, but Marcus could see the satisfied smirk on her face reflected in the whiteboard surface. For the rest of the class, Marcus remained silent, taking notes but no longer participating. He could feel the weight of his classmates' stares, some sympathetic, others judgmental. He had walked into this room with hope and excitement, eager to learn and prove himself. Now he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. As the bell rang and students began packing up their things, Professor Richardson called out, "Mr. Johnson, please stay after class. I'd like to have a word with you." Marcus's stomach dropped, but he nodded and remained seated as his classmates filed out. Sarah gave him an encouraging smile as she passed, whispering, "Good luck." When the room was empty except for Marcus and the professor, she walked over to his desk, her expression stern. "Let me be clear about something, young man. This isn't a game. This is a serious academic environment where we study advanced engineering principles. I don't know what strings were pulled to get you into this class, but I won't have you disrupting my teaching with your enthusiasm." Marcus looked up at her, his jaw set. "I'm not trying to disrupt anything, Professor. I just want to learn." "Then learn to listen," she snapped. "And learn your place. You may have impressed someone with your little parlor tricks, but real engineering requires discipline, rigor, and respect for authority. Do I make myself clear?" Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. "Good. Now get out of my classroom, and don't let me see this kind of behavior again." As Marcus packed his things and walked toward the door, he felt a mixture of hurt and determination. Professor Richardson had tried to put him in his place, to make him feel small and unwelcome. But Marcus had faced adversity before, and he wasn't about to give up now. He had earned his place in this classroom, and he was going to prove that he belonged here, regardless of what his professor thought. The hallway was bustling with students changing classes, but Marcus barely noticed them. His mind was already racing ahead to tomorrow's lesson, thinking about how he could prove himself without stepping on Professor Richardson's ego. He had a lot to learn, not just about engineering, but about navigating a world that didn't always welcome people who looked like him. But Marcus Johnson had never backed down from a challenge, and he wasn't about to start now. The next morning, Marcus arrived at classroom 304 15 minutes early, hoping to make a better impression. He had spent the previous evening reviewing his notes and researching the topics Professor Richardson had covered, determined to show that he was serious about his studies. The classroom was empty except for the professor, who was writing equations on the whiteboard with sharp, precise strokes. Professor Richardson glanced up as Marcus entered, her expression immediately souring. "You're early," she observed, her tone suggesting this was somehow inappropriate. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied politely. "I wanted to review yesterday's material before class started." "How admirable," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Though I wonder if your time might be better spent in a more age-appropriate environment. Perhaps a nice middle school science class where you could learn about simple machines and basic physics." Marcus felt his cheeks burn, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm exactly where I need to be, Professor Richardson. I earned my place in this class." She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Earned? Oh, my dear boy, you have no idea what earning something truly means. Affirmative action policies and diversity quotas may have gotten you through that door, but they won't help you understand the complex material we cover here." Other students began filtering into the classroom, and Marcus was grateful for the interruption. He took his seat in the back corner, trying to ignore the professor's pointed stares and the whispered conversations of his classmates. Some of the whispers were sympathetic, but others were clearly judgmental. "I heard he's only 12, one student murmured to another. "What kind of parents let their kids skip that many grades?" "Maybe he's some kind of genius," another replied. "Like those kids you see on TV." "Or maybe it's just another diversity experiment," a third voice added, and Marcus's jaw tightened. Professor Richardson called the class to order, her voice cutting through the morning chatter like a blade. "Today we'll be discussing the practical applications of thermodynamic principles in engine design. I want you to understand that engineering isn't just about memorizing formulas, it requires deep theoretical understanding and years of rigorous study. She began drawing complex diagrams on the whiteboard, her explanations becoming increasingly technical. Marcus followed along easily, his hand moving quickly as he took detailed notes. But he noticed something troubling: the professor's explanations were overly theoretical, divorced from the practical realities of how engines actually worked. The ideal gas law, Professor Richardson explained, assumes that gas molecules have no volume and no intermolecular forces. In our calculations, we use this assumption to simplify our analysis of engine performance. She paused, scanning the room. Of course, in reality, these assumptions don't hold perfectly, but for our purposes, they're adequate. Marcus's hand shot up before he could stop himself. But Professor, in real-world applications, especially at high pressures and temperatures like in an engine cylinder, those assumptions break down significantly. Wouldn't it be more accurate to use the van der Waals equation or at least acknowledge the limitations? The room fell silent. Professor Richardson's face darkened, and Marcus immediately regretted speaking up. He had promised himself he would be more careful, but his passion for the subject had overridden his caution. "Mr. Johnson," Professor Richardson said, her voice dangerously quiet, "are you suggesting that I don't understand the limitations of the models I'm teaching?" "No, ma'am," Marcus replied quickly. "I just thought." "You thought wrong," she interrupted. "This is an introductory course, and we focus on fundamental principles. Advanced corrections and real-world complications are beyond the scope of what we're covering. I suggest you focus on mastering the basics before you attempt to run with the advanced students." Marcus felt his face burn with embarrassment and anger. He wasn't trying to show off or challenge her authority, he was genuinely interested in understanding how things really worked. But it was clear that Professor Richardson interpreted any question or comment from him as a challenge to her expertise. Furthermore, she continued, her voice rising slightly, "I find it presumptuous for someone with no formal engineering education to question teaching methods that have been refined over decades. Your experience changing oil doesn't qualify you to critique academic engineering pedagogy." Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The attack felt personal and unnecessary, even to those who had been skeptical of Marcus's presence in the class. Sarah, the kind girl who had spoken to him the day before, shot him a sympathetic look. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to control his emotions. "I apologize, Professor. I didn't mean to question your teaching methods. I was just curious about the practical applications." "Curiosity is fine," Professor Richardson replied, her tone still sharp, but it should be tempered with humility and respect. "You're here to learn, not to demonstrate whatever superficial knowledge you think you've acquired from working in a garage." The word "garage" dripped with contempt, and Marcus felt something snap inside him. His Uncle Jerome's shop wasn't just a garage, it was a place where complex problems were solved every day, where theory met reality, and where real engineering happened. But he forced himself to remain calm. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. As Marcus approached the experimental engine, the weight of 30 pairs of eyes felt like a physical presence pressing against his back. The classroom had transformed into an arena, with his classmates forming a tight circle around the machinery, their faces displaying a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and anticipation. Some whispered among themselves, placing informal bets on whether the 12-year-old would succeed or fail spectacularly. 18 minutes remaining, Professor Richardson announced, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. She held her stopwatch prominently, making sure everyone could see the time ticking away. "Perhaps Mr. Johnson would like to share his initial assessment with the class?" Marcus ignored her, focusing instead on the engine before him. It was indeed a sophisticated piece of machinery, a 4-cylinder unit with variable compression ratios controlled by hydraulic actuators. Computer sensors monitored everything from oil pressure to combustion chamber temperatures, and the electronic control unit was more advanced than anything he'd seen in his uncle's shop. But beneath all the high-tech components, it was still an engine. And engines, no matter how complex, followed the same basic principles Marcus had been learning since he was 8 years old. "He's just staring at it," whispered Jake, a senior engineering student who had been particularly vocal about Marcus not belonging in the class. "What kind of diagnosis is that?" "Maybe he's trying to commune with the engine spirits," another student joked, earning nervous laughter from several classmates. Sarah, the kind girl who had been supportive of Marcus, shot them a disapproving look. "Give him a chance," she said quietly. "He's barely started." But even Sarah looked concerned as Marcus continued his silent examination. The other students had expected him to immediately start tearing into the engine, pulling components apart with the enthusiasm of a child with a new toy. Instead, he was methodically studying the machine, his dark eyes taking in every detail. 17 minutes, Professor Richardson announced. "Mr. Johnson, I hope you're not planning to solve this problem through meditation. Our graduate students have already spent countless hours staring at this engine." Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm and focused. "Has anyone checked the maintenance records? I need to know what's been done to this engine and when." Professor Richardson's eyebrows rose. "Maintenance records? Mr. Johnson, this is a precision research instrument, not some jalopy from a junkyard. Every component has been carefully manufactured to exact specifications." "That's not what I asked," Marcus replied, his tone respectful but firm. "I need to know what work has been done, what parts have been replaced, and what symptoms were observed during previous failures." The professor's jaw tightened. "Mr. Johnson, you're wasting precious time asking for information that's irrelevant to the problem. The engine's design is sound, its components are pristine, and its manufacturing is flawless. The problem is clearly something more subtle than basic maintenance issues." Marcus nodded, understanding that he wouldn't get the information he wanted. But the professor's defensive response told him something important: she was more invested in proving the engine's theoretical perfection than in actually solving the problem. 16 minutes remaining, Professor Richardson announced. "Perhaps it's time to actually examine the engine instead of asking questions." Marcus knelt beside the engine, his hands hovering over the components without touching them. He could feel the heat signatures from various parts, smell the lingering odors of oil and metal, and hear the subtle sounds of settling components. These were the sensory clues that no textbook could teach and no computer simulation could replicate. "What's he doing now?" Jake muttered. "It looks like he's performing some kind of ritual." "He's using his senses," Sarah said, surprising herself with her understanding. "He's gathering information that instruments can't detect." Professor Richardson overheard and snorted derisively. "Gathering information? Mr. Johnson, this engine has been monitored by sophisticated sensors that can detect variations in temperature, pressure, and vibration down to the finest detail. Whatever information your senses can provide has already been recorded and analyzed." Marcus looked up at her, his expression serious. "Sensors can only detect what they're designed to measure. Sometimes the most important clues are the ones nobody thought to look for." 15 minutes, the professor announced, her voice taking on a tone of gleeful anticipation. "Mr. Johnson, you've now spent a quarter of your time asking questions and sniffing around the engine. Perhaps it's time to actually diagnose the problem." The pressure in the room was becoming palpable. Several students were shifting nervously, some feeling genuinely uncomfortable with the professor's obvious desire to see Marcus fail. Others were beginning to question whether they were witnessing a fair challenge or a calculated humiliation. "This isn't right," whispered Emma, a junior who had been quietly observing the confrontation. "She's not giving him a fair chance." "Fair," replied David, another senior. "He's the one who claimed practical experience was superior to academic training. Now he gets to prove it." But even David looked troubled as he watched Professor Richardson's behavior. The professor was clearly enjoying Marcus's predicament, her smile becoming more pronounced with each passing minute. This wasn't just about testing a student's knowledge, it was personal. Marcus began his physical examination of the engine, his hands moving with practiced precision over the components. He checked the oil level and consistency, examined the spark plugs for signs of fouling or overheating, and tested the tension of various belts and hoses. His movements were methodical and purposeful, but to his classmates, they looked disappointingly ordinary. "He's just doing basic maintenance checks," Jake observed dismissively. "Anyone could do that." 14 minutes remaining, Professor Richardson announced. "Mr. Johnson, I'm not seeing any sophisticated diagnostic techniques. Where are the advanced troubleshooting methods that your practical experience was supposed to provide?" Marcus paused in his examination, looking up at the professor with a slight frown. "Sometimes the most sophisticated problems have simple causes. Before I look for exotic failures, I need to eliminate the obvious possibilities." "Obvious possibilities?" Professor Richardson laughed. "Mr. Johnson, this engine has been examined by students who understand advanced diagnostic techniques. Do you really think they would have missed something obvious?" Marcus returned to his work, but his classmates could see the tension in his shoulders. The constant pressure from Professor Richardson was clearly affecting him, and the ticking clock was making everyone nervous. Even his supporters were beginning to wonder if he was in over his head. 13 minutes, the professor announced. "Mr. Johnson, you're running out of time. Perhaps this would be a good moment to admit that some problems require more than garage-level knowledge to solve." Sarah stepped forward, her voice firm. "Professor Richardson, with respect, you're not giving him a fair chance to work. The constant commentary is distracting and unnecessary." Professor Richardson's eyes flashed with anger. "Miss Chen, I'm conducting this evaluation as I see fit. If Mr. Johnson is distracted by simple observations, then perhaps he's not as competent as he claims to be." The confrontation between Sarah and the professor created a moment of silence that Marcus used to refocus his attention. He had found something interesting in his examination, slight scoring marks on the cylinder walls that suggested metal-to-metal contact. But the pattern was unusual, not consistent with typical bearing failure or oil starvation. 12 minutes remaining, Professor Richardson announced. "Mr. Johnson, I notice you're spending a lot of time looking at the cylinders. Our graduate students have already examined them thoroughly with borescopes and found no significant wear patterns." Marcus looked up, his expression thoughtful. "What oil are you using in this engine?" The question seemed to surprise Professor Richardson. "Oil? We're using the manufacturer's recommended grade, of course. A high-quality synthetic blend specifically designed for research applications." "What about the oil change intervals?" Marcus asked. "How often has the oil been changed?" Professor Richardson's expression grew impatient. "Mr. Johnson, the oil is changed according to the manufacturer's specifications. These are not the kinds of basic maintenance issues that would cause the sophisticated problems we're experiencing." But Marcus was already moving toward the oil fill cap, his mind racing through possibilities. The scoring patterns he had observed were consistent with a lubrication problem, but not the obvious kind that would result from low oil levels or contaminated oil. 11 minutes remaining, Professor Richardson announced, her voice taking on a triumphant tone. "Mr. Johnson, you're halfway through your allotted time, and I'm not seeing any progress toward identifying the actual problem." Marcus unscrewed the oil fill cap and peered inside, using his phone's flashlight to illuminate the internal components. What he saw made him pause, his expression changing from concentration to understanding. 10 minutes remaining, the professor announced. "Mr. Johnson, time is running short. Perhaps you'd like to share your findings with the class." Marcus looked up, his eyes meeting Professor Richardson's gaze. For the first time since the challenge began, he smiled, a small, confident expression that sent a chill through the professor's triumphant mood. "I need to see the oil filter," Marcus said quietly. "The oil filter?" Professor Richardson repeated, her voice betraying a note of uncertainty. "Mr. Johnson, the oil filter is a basic component. It's been checked and replaced according to maintenance schedules." "I still need to see it," Marcus insisted, his voice growing stronger. "And I need to know exactly what type of oil has been used and when it was last changed." Professor Richardson's confident smile began to falter as she realized that Marcus might actually be onto something. The other students sensed the shift in atmosphere, the growing possibility that the 12-year-old might actually solve the problem that had stumped their best graduate students. 9 minutes remaining, she announced, but her voice had lost its gleeful anticipation. Marcus was already moving toward the oil filter housing, his hands working with practiced efficiency. As he began to remove the filter, his classmates crowded closer, their skepticism gradually giving way to genuine curiosity. The real test was about to reach its climax, and nobody, not even Marcus himself, knew exactly what he would find. Marcus's hands moved with quiet precision as he located the oil filter housing, his movements taking on the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this task hundreds of times before. The classroom had grown unusually quiet, with even the most skeptical students leaning forward to see what he would discover. Professor Richardson watched nervously, her confident smile fading as she realized that Marcus might actually be following a legitimate diagnostic path. 8 minutes remaining, she announced, but her voice lacked its earlier triumphant tone. Marcus carefully removed the oil filter, his face showing no emotion as he examined the component. But his classmates could see his jaw tighten slightly, and Sarah noticed his eyes narrow with understanding. He was clearly seeing something significant, but he wasn't sharing his findings yet. "Mr. Johnson," Professor Richardson said, her voice carrying a note of forced casualness, "I hope you're not planning to solve this complex engineering problem by simply changing the oil filter. Our maintenance staff has been quite thorough in there." "Professor," Marcus interrupted quietly, "could you tell me exactly what oil specification was used in this engine? Not just the viscosity grade, but the specific formulation and manufacturer." The question seemed to catch Professor Richardson off guard. Well, I assume our maintenance staff used whatever oil was specified by the manufacturer. These are standard maintenance procedures, Mr. Johnson. The oil choice is hardly relevant to the sophisticated problems we're experiencing." Marcus set the oil filter aside and moved toward the oil drain plug, his movements becoming more urgent. "It's not about what oil was specified," he said, his voice growing stronger. "It's about what oil was actually used, and whether it's compatible with the engine's materials." 7 minutes remaining, Professor Richardson announced, but she was clearly growing uncomfortable with the direction of Marcus's investigation. Jake, the senior student who had been most vocal in his skepticism, leaned over to whisper to his neighbor. "He's just doing basic maintenance stuff. How is changing oil going to solve an engine seizure problem?" But Sarah was watching Marcus more carefully, and she could see the focused intensity in his movements. This wasn't random troubleshooting, he was following a specific diagnostic path based on observations that the rest of them couldn't see. Marcus drained a small amount of oil into a container, then held it up to the light. The oil appeared normal to the casual observer, but Marcus was examining it with the practiced eye of someone who understood the subtle signs of oil degradation and contamination. "Mr. Johnson," Professor Richardson said, her voice taking on an edge of impatience, "you're spending valuable time on basic maintenance checks that have already been performed by qualified technicians. Perhaps you should focus on more sophisticated diagnostic techniques." Marcus looked up at her, his expression serious. "Professor, what temperature does this engine typically reach during operation?" "Temperature?" Professor Richardson seemed surprised by the question. "It operates within normal parameters, of course. The cooling system is adequate, and the temperature gauges show no overheating." "That's not what I asked," Marcus replied firmly. "I need to know the specific operating temperatures, especially in the oil passages and bearing areas." Professor Richardson's eyes flashed with irritation. "Mr. Johnson, you have 6 minutes remaining. Instead of asking questions that our graduate students have already addressed, perhaps you should focus on actually solving the problem." But Marcus was already examining the engine's oil passages, using his phone's flashlight to peer into areas that were normally hidden from view. His expression grew more concerned as he studied the internal components, and his movements became more urgent. 5 minutes remaining, Professor Richardson announced, her voice regaining some of its earlier confidence. "Mr. Johnson, you're running out of time, and I'm not seeing any progress toward identifying the actual cause of the engine seizure. Marcus stood up, his face showing the first signs of real concern. I need to check the oil pump, he said, his voice tight with concentration. The oil pump? Professor Richardson repeated. Mr. Johnson, the oil pump is a precision component that has been tested and verified. You can't simply assume that a basic component like an oil pump would cause the sophisticated problems we're experiencing. I'm not assuming anything, Marcus replied, his voice growing stronger. I'm following the evidence. The oil filter shows signs of unusual debris, the oil itself has an unusual consistency, and the temperature patterns suggest uneven lubrication distribution. For the first time, some of his classmates began to look impressed. Marcus wasn't just randomly checking components, he was building a coherent diagnostic picture based on multiple pieces of evidence. For minutes remaining, Professor Richardson announced, but her voice had lost its earlier triumphant tone. Marcus began examining the oil pump assembly, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. The pump was more complex than those he had worked with in his uncle's shop, but the basic principles were the same. Oil pumps were responsible for maintaining proper lubrication pressure throughout the engine, and any failure could cause catastrophic damage. Mr. Johnson, Professor Richardson said, her voice carrying a note of forced casualness, I should mention that the oil pump has been thoroughly tested by our graduate students. The pressure readings are within normal specifications, and the flow rates meet the manufacturer's requirements. Marcus looked up at her, his expression thoughtful. What about the oil pump's internal clearances? Has anyone checked for wear or damage to the internal components? The question seemed to hit Professor Richardson like a physical blow. Her face went pale, and she struggled to maintain her composed expression. Internal clearances? Mr. Johnson, that would require disassembling the oil pump, which is, well, it's not something that would be done unless there was a specific reason to suspect. 3 minutes remaining, she announced, but her voice was barely audible. Marcus was already working to access the oil pump's internal components, his movements becoming more confident as he followed his diagnostic instincts. His classmates watched in fascination as he systematically eliminated possibilities and focused on the most likely causes of the engine's problems. He actually knows what he's doing, Emma whispered to David, her voice filled with surprise and admiration. It looks like it, David replied, his earlier skepticism replaced by genuine curiosity. I've never seen anyone approach engine diagnosis quite like this. Sarah felt a surge of pride and vindication. She had sensed from the beginning that Marcus was special, that his quiet confidence was based on real knowledge and skill. Now she was watching him prove it under the most challenging circumstances possible. 2 minutes remaining, Professor Richardson announced, her voice shaking slightly. Marcus had successfully accessed the oil pump's internals, and what he found made him pause. His expression shifted from concentration to understanding, and then to something approaching satisfaction. He had found the problem. 1 minute remaining, Professor Richardson said, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus looked up at the class, his eyes meeting Professor Richardson's gaze. For the first time since the challenge began, he smiled, a confident, knowing expression that sent a chill through the professor's confidence. I found it, he said quietly. The classroom erupted in excited whispers as Marcus prepared to reveal his findings. Professor Richardson stood frozen, her stopwatch in her hand, realizing that she might have just witnessed something extraordinary. Time, she whispered, but nobody was listening anymore. All eyes were on Marcus as he prepared to explain how a 12-year-old had solved a problem that had stumped graduate students for months. The moment of truth had arrived. Marcus stood up from his crouched position beside the oil pump, his hands covered in oil but his expression radiating quiet confidence. The classroom had fallen into complete silence, with 30 pairs of eyes fixed on him as he prepared to reveal his findings. Professor Richardson clutched her stopwatch, her face pale with the growing realization that her carefully orchestrated humiliation might be about to backfire spectacularly. Time is up, Mr. Johnson, Professor Richardson said, her voice barely above a whisper. You have 2 minutes remaining to implement your solution. Marcus nodded calmly, wiping his hands on a shop rag. I don't need 2 minutes, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent classroom. I need about 30 seconds. The boldness of his statement sent a ripple of excitement through his classmates. Even the most skeptical students leaned forward, eager to see what Marcus had discovered and whether he could actually deliver on his confident promise. 30 seconds. Professor Richardson repeated, her voice betraying a mixture of disbelief and growing concern. Mr. Johnson, this engine has been analyzed by our finest graduate students for months. You can't possibly solve such a complex problem in 30 seconds. Marcus looked directly at her, his dark eyes steady and determined. Professor, the problem isn't complex. It's actually quite simple once you understand what you're looking for. The complexity comes from overthinking the solution. He turned to address the entire class, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher explaining a concept to interested students. This engine has been seizing because of oil pump cavitation. The internal clearances in the oil pump have been machined too tightly, causing the pump to create vacuum bubbles in the oil. When those bubbles collapse, they create pressure spikes that cause the oil to foam and lose its lubricating properties. Professor Richardson's face went white. Oil pump cavitation? That's not possible. The oil pump specifications were checked and verified. The clearances meet the manufacturer's requirements. They meet the printed requirements, Marcus agreed, but they don't account for the thermal expansion differences between the aluminum pump housing and the steel internal components. When the engine reaches operating temperature, the differential expansion causes the clearances to become too tight. The explanation was so clear and logical that several students began nodding in understanding. Sarah felt a surge of pride and vindication. Marcus wasn't just guessing or getting lucky. He was demonstrating genuine expertise and insight. But how could you possibly know that? Jake asked, his earlier skepticism replaced by genuine curiosity. That's an incredibly sophisticated failure mode. Marcus smiled, the first truly relaxed expression he had shown since entering the classroom. Because I've seen it before. Not in an engine this advanced, but in a modified Honda Civic that my uncle was working on. The owner had installed a high-pressure oil pump without considering the thermal expansion effects. The symptoms were identical, perfect operation for a few minutes, then sudden seizure. Professor Richardson's hands were shaking as she tried to process what she was hearing. But our graduate students, they ran computer simulations, they analyzed the theoretical performance. They analyzed the theoretical performance at room temperature, Marcus said gently. But engines don't run at room temperature. They run at operating temperature, where material properties change and thermal expansion becomes a critical factor. The elegance of the solution was becoming apparent to everyone in the classroom. Marcus had identified a failure mode that was both sophisticated and simple, requiring both theoretical understanding and practical experience to recognize. So what's your solution? Emma asked, her voice filled with genuine interest. Marcus turned toward the oil pump, his movements confident and purposeful. I need to increase the internal clearances by about 0.02 of an inch. In a professional shop, we'd use precision grinding equipment, but for a quick fix, I can use a technique my uncle taught me. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small bottle of what appeared to be ordinary motor oil. But as he unscrewed the cap, the distinctive smell of a specialized additive filled the air. This is a molybdenum disulfide oil additive, Marcus explained. It creates a microscopically thin film on metal surfaces that reduces friction and increases effective clearances. It's a temporary fix, but it should allow the engine to run long enough to prove that my diagnosis is correct. Professor Richardson watched in horror as Marcus began adding the additive to the engine's oil system. Mr. Johnson, you can't just add random chemicals to a precision research engine. That could cause contamination, corrosion, or other serious problems. It's not random, Marcus replied calmly. Molybdenum disulfide is a well-known friction modifier that's been used in racing engines for decades. It's chemically inert, thermally stable, and completely compatible with conventional motor oil. The only risk is that it might actually solve the problem. The confidence in his voice was unmistakable, and even his harshest critics were beginning to recognize that Marcus knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't the desperate improvisation of someone who was in over his head, it was the methodical application of knowledge and experience to solve a real-world problem. "How long will it take to see results?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with anticipation. "If I'm right, the engine should start and run smoothly within about 30 seconds, Marcus replied. "The additive works almost immediately, and if cavitation was the problem, eliminating it should restore normal oil pressure and lubrication." Marcus moved to the engine's control panel, his hands hovering over the start button. The entire classroom held its breath as he prepared to test his theory. Professor Richardson stood frozen, her career and reputation hanging in the balance. "Ready?" Marcus asked, looking around the classroom at his classmates' eager faces. "Do it," Sarah whispered, speaking for the entire class. Marcus pressed the start button, and the engine immediately came to life with a smooth, steady rumble. The sound was completely different from the rough, struggling noise that had characterized its previous attempts to run. The engine ran smoothly, its various systems operating in perfect harmony. The classroom erupted in cheers and applause. Students who had been skeptical of Marcus just minutes before were now celebrating his success, their earlier doubts replaced by genuine admiration and respect. Even Jake was clapping, his face showing a mixture of amazement and chagrin. Professor Richardson stood silent, her face pale and her hands trembling. She had just witnessed a 12-year-old solve a problem that had stumped her best graduate students, using knowledge and techniques that weren't taught in any textbook. "How long has it been running?" Emma asked, her voice filled with excitement. Marcus checked his phone. 3 minutes and counting. If it was going to seize, it would have happened by now. The engine continued to run smoothly, its steady rhythm filling the classroom with the sound of mechanical perfection. Marcus had not only diagnosed the problem correctly but had implemented a solution that worked exactly as he had predicted. 5 minutes, Sarah announced, her voice filled with pride and satisfaction. Professor Richardson finally found her voice, though it was barely above a whisper. How did you know? How could you possibly have known that?" Marcus looked at her with an expression that held no malice or triumph, only quiet satisfaction. "Because I listened to the engine. I looked at the evidence without any preconceptions about what the problem should be. And I drew on every bit of knowledge and experience I had, regardless of where I learned it." He paused, his gaze steady and direct. Sometimes the most sophisticated problems have simple solutions. But you have to be willing to look beyond the theory and understand how things actually work in the real world. The engine continued to run smoothly, its perfect operation serving as a testament to Marcus's skill and insight. Professor Richardson had issued a challenge designed to humiliate him, but instead, she had created the stage for his greatest triumph. The 12-year-old had not only solved the impossible problem, he had done it with grace, intelligence, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you're doing. The experimental engine continued its smooth, steady operation, each passing minute serving as undeniable proof of Marcus's diagnostic brilliance. The classroom had transformed from a place of skepticism and confrontation into something resembling a celebration, with students crowding around the engine in amazement and admiration. 7 minutes and still running perfectly, Sarah announced, her voice filled with excitement and pride. She had believed in Marcus from the beginning, and now she was watching him prove that her faith had been justified. Professor Richardson stood frozen at the front of the classroom, her carefully constructed world of academic superiority crumbling around her. She had spent decades building her reputation on the belief that formal education and theoretical knowledge were superior to practical experience. Now a 12-year-old had shattered that belief in front of her entire class. "This is incredible," Emma whispered to David, her eyes wide with wonder. "He actually did it. He solved a problem that stumped graduate students for months." David nodded, his earlier skepticism completely replaced by genuine respect. I've never seen anything like it. The way he approached the problem, the way he connected different pieces of evidence, it was like watching a master craftsman at work. Marcus stood beside the engine, monitoring its operation with the calm professionalism of an experienced mechanic. But his classmates could see the quiet satisfaction in his eyes, the vindication of someone who had been dismissed and underestimated finally proving his worth. "Mr. Johnson," Jake said, his voice filled with newfound respect, "I owe you an apology. I thought you were just a kid who got lucky with a scholarship. I was wrong." Marcus looked at him with a slight smile. "No apology needed. I understand why you were skeptical. Age and appearance can be deceiving, and I know I don't look like a typical engineering student." "It's not about how you look," Sarah interjected firmly. "It's about what you know and what you can do. And you've just proven that you belong here more than anyone else in this room." The engine's continued smooth operation was becoming increasingly impressive. Each minute that passed without seizure was another nail in the coffin of Professor Richardson's assumptions about the superiority of academic knowledge over practical experience. 8 minutes, Emma announced, her voice filled with awe. "Professor Richardson, I think it's time you acknowledged what we've all just witnessed here." Professor Richardson's face was a mask of conflicting emotions: shock, disbelief, anger, and something that might have been shame. She had issued a challenge designed to humiliate Marcus and prove her own superiority, but instead, she had created the perfect opportunity for him to demonstrate his exceptional abilities. This is highly irregular," she finally managed to say, her voice shaking slightly. "The engine may be running now, but we don't know if this is a permanent solution or just a temporary fix." Marcus looked at her with an expression of patient understanding. "You're right that this is a temporary fix. The molybdenum disulfide additive will work for several hours, maybe even days, but it's not a permanent solution. The real fix would require remachining the oil pump components to proper clearances." "Then you haven't actually solved the problem," Professor Richardson said, grasping at this potential escape from her predicament. "I've identified the problem and demonstrated a solution," Marcus replied calmly. "The permanent fix is a matter of implementation, not diagnosis. Any competent machine shop could remachine the pump components to the correct specifications." The distinction was important, and his classmates recognized it immediately. Marcus had done exactly what Professor Richardson had challenged him to do: diagnose the problem and implement a solution. The fact that a more permanent fix would require additional work didn't diminish his achievement. 9 minutes, Sarah announced, her voice carrying a note of triumph. Professor Richardson was running out of ways to dismiss or minimize Marcus's success. The engine was running smoothly, his diagnosis was clearly correct, and his solution was working exactly as he had predicted. She had issued a public challenge, and he had met it completely. "Professor Richardson," Marcus said, his voice respectful but firm, "I believe you made a promise. You said that if I succeeded, you would publicly acknowledge that practical experience has value in engineering education." The classroom fell silent as everyone turned to look at Professor Richardson. She stood there for a long moment, her face cycling through various emotions as she struggled with the reality of what had just happened. "You also said you would recommend me for advanced placement in graduate-level courses," Marcus continued, his voice still respectful but gaining strength. "I'm holding you to that promise." 10 minutes, Sarah announced, her voice filled with quiet satisfaction. The engine continued its smooth operation, its steady rhythm serving as a mechanical drumbeat for Marcus's triumph. Professor Richardson could no longer deny what had happened, could no longer dismiss or minimize his achievement. "Furthermore," Marcus said, his voice taking on a tone of quiet authority, "I think this demonstrates something important about the value of different types of knowledge. Theoretical understanding and practical experience aren't competing with each other, they complement each other. The best engineering solutions come from combining both." His words carried the wisdom of someone who had learned to see beyond the artificial divisions that academia sometimes created. He wasn't trying to prove that practical knowledge was superior to theoretical knowledge, he was proving that both were necessary for true understanding. 11 minutes, Emma announced, her voice filled with admiration. Professor Richardson finally found her voice, though it was barely above a whisper. How did you learn to think like that? How did you develop such diagnostic skills at your age?" Marcus looked at her with an expression that held no malice, only patience and understanding. "I learned from my uncle, who learned from his father, who learned from his father before him. Each generation passed down not just techniques and knowledge, but ways of thinking about problems and solutions." He paused, his gaze steady and direct. "But I also learned from books, from online courses, from anyone who was willing to teach me. I never thought that practical knowledge and theoretical knowledge were separate things. To me, they're just different ways of understanding the same reality." The engine continued its smooth operation, each passing minute serving as proof of the power of Marcus's approach. Professor Richardson had tried to create a confrontation between academic theory and practical experience, but Marcus had shown that the real power came from combining both. 12 minutes, Sarah announced, her voice filled with pride and satisfaction. Professor Richardson stood silent, her world of assumptions and prejudices crumbling around her. She had thought she was dealing with an uppity child who needed to be put in his place. Instead, she had encountered a genuine talent, a young person who represented the future of engineering education. Marcus looked around the classroom at his classmates' faces, seeing respect, admiration, and genuine curiosity where there had once been skepticism and doubt. He had not only solved the impossible problem, he had done it in a way that opened minds and changed perspectives. The breakthrough wasn't just mechanical, it was human. And its effects would ripple through that classroom and beyond for years to come. The experimental engine had now been running flawlessly for 15 minutes, its steady rhythm serving as a mechanical testament to Marcus's diagnostic brilliance. The classroom atmosphere had completely transformed from one of skeptical confrontation to genuine amazement and respect. Students who had entered the room expecting to witness a 12-year-old's humiliation were instead witnessing something extraordinary, the triumph of knowledge, insight, and determination over prejudice and assumption. Professor Richardson stood at the front of the classroom, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly as she struggled to process what she had witnessed. Her carefully constructed world of academic superiority had been shattered by a child who had demonstrated knowledge and skills that her graduate students couldn't match. 15 minutes and counting, Sarah announced, her voice filled with quiet triumph. She had believed in Marcus from the beginning, and now she was watching him prove that her faith had been justified beyond her wildest expectations. Marcus stood beside the engine, monitoring its operation with the calm professionalism of an experienced mechanic. But his classmates could see something else in his expression, not arrogance or triumph, but a quiet satisfaction that came from solving a challenging problem and proving that different types of knowledge could work together. "Mr. Johnson," David said, his voice filled with genuine curiosity, "can you walk us through your diagnostic process? I want to understand how you identified the problem so quickly." Marcus nodded, clearly pleased by the genuine interest in his methods. The key was listening to the engine and looking for patterns that didn't fit the theoretical models. Everyone was focused on the high-tech components and sophisticated systems, but I started with the basics. He moved to the oil filter he had removed earlier, holding it up for the class to see. The debris pattern in this filter told me that the engine was experiencing unusual wear, but the pattern was inconsistent with typical bearing failure or oil starvation. "What made you think it was cavitation?" Emma asked, her voice filled with admiration. "The timing," Marcus replied. "The engine would run perfectly for a few minutes, then seize suddenly. That's not consistent with gradual wear or contamination, it's consistent with a sudden loss of lubrication due to oil foaming." Professor Richardson finally found her voice, though it was barely above a whisper. "But how could you possibly know about cavitation effects in oil pumps? That's not basic automotive knowledge." Marcus looked at her with an expression of patient understanding. "You're right that it's not basic knowledge. But I've been working with engines for 4 years, and I've seen a lot of unusual problems. My uncle taught me to always look for the unexpected, to question assumptions, and to draw on every bit of knowledge I had." He paused, his gaze steady and direct. But I also learned about cavitation from reading engineering textbooks, from online courses, and from talking to other mechanics who had encountered similar problems. Knowledge doesn't have to come from just one source. The engine continued its smooth operation, each passing minute serving as proof of the power of Marcus's approach. He had not only solved the problem but had done so using a combination of theoretical knowledge and practical experience that none of his classmates possessed. 16 minutes, Jake announced, his voice filled with respect and amazement. The senior student who had been most vocal in his skepticism was now one of Marcus's most ardent admirers. Professor Richardson was clearly struggling with the reality of what had happened. She had issued a challenge designed to humiliate Marcus and prove her own superiority, but instead, she had created the perfect opportunity for him to demonstrate his exceptional abilities. "This changes everything," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "If a 12-year-old can solve problems that our graduate students can't, then we need to seriously reconsider our teaching methods and our assumptions about knowledge and expertise." Marcus looked at her with an expression that held no malice or triumph, only understanding and perhaps a touch of sympathy. "Professor Richardson, you don't need to change everything. You just need to recognize that knowledge comes in many forms, and that practical experience can complement theoretical understanding." 17 minutes, Sarah announced, her voice filled with pride and satisfaction. The engine's continued smooth operation was becoming increasingly impressive. Each minute that passed without seizure was another confirmation of Marcus's diagnostic accuracy and his solution's effectiveness. "Mr. Johnson," Professor Richardson said, her voice shaking slightly, "I owe you an apology. I misjudged you based on your age and background, and I was wrong. You've demonstrated knowledge and skills that I didn't think were possible for someone your age." Marcus nodded graciously, accepting the apology with the maturity of someone far older than his 12 years. "Thank you, Professor. I appreciate that, and I hope we can work together going forward." 18 minutes, Emma announced, her voice filled with awe. The classroom had become a place of genuine learning and discovery, with students asking questions about diagnostic techniques, problem-solving methods, and the integration of theoretical and practical knowledge. Marcus answered each question with patience and insight, clearly enjoying the opportunity to share his knowledge with genuinely interested classmates. "Professor Richardson," Marcus said, his voice respectful but firm, "I believe you made some promises when you issued this challenge. You said you would publicly acknowledge that practical experience has value in engineering education, and you said you would recommend me for advanced placement in graduate-level courses." Professor Richardson nodded slowly, her face showing a mixture of resignation and perhaps a touch of admiration. "Yes, I did make those promises, and I intend to keep them. You've more than earned both the acknowledgement and the recommendation." 19 minutes, Sarah announced, her voice filled with quiet triumph. The engine continued its smooth operation, its steady rhythm serving as a mechanical soundtrack to Marcus's victory. He had not only met Professor Richardson's challenge but had exceeded it, demonstrating not just technical skill but also grace, maturity, and wisdom in his approach to both problems and people. 20 minutes, Jake announced, his voice filled with respect and amazement. As the engine reached the 20-minute mark, continuing to run smoothly and efficiently, it became clear that Marcus had achieved something extraordinary. He had taken a challenge designed to humiliate him and turned it into a platform for demonstrating his exceptional abilities. But more than that, he had shown his classmates and his professor that knowledge and expertise could come from unexpected sources, that age and appearance didn't determine ability, and that the best solutions often came from combining different types of understanding. Professor Richardson stood silent for a long moment, watching the engine run and processing the full implications of what had just happened. Finally, she spoke, her voice clear and strong. "Class," she said, "you have just witnessed something remarkable. Mr. Johnson has not only solved a problem that stumped our best graduate students, but he has done so in a way that demonstrates the value of integrating theoretical knowledge with practical experience." She paused, looking directly at Marcus with an expression of genuine respect and perhaps a touch of awe. "Mr. Johnson, you have my public acknowledgement that practical experience has immense value in engineering education. And you have my commitment to recommend you for advanced placement in our graduate-level courses. You've earned both through your demonstration of exceptional skill, knowledge, and maturity." The classroom erupted in applause, with students cheering and congratulating Marcus on his remarkable achievement. He had entered the room as an outsider, dismissed and underestimated, but he was leaving as a proven expert who had earned the respect and admiration of everyone present. Against all odds, the 12-year-old had not only succeeded, he had triumphed completely, changing minds and opening possibilities that none of them had imagined when the day began. The applause in classroom 304 gradually subsided, but the energy in the room remained electric. Marcus stood beside the still-running engine, his quiet confidence having transformed the entire dynamic of the class. What had begun as Professor Richardson's attempt to humiliate him had become a masterclass in problem-solving, critical thinking, and the integration of theoretical and practical knowledge. Professor Richardson stepped forward, her face showing a complex mixture of emotions, shame, admiration, and something that might have been newfound respect. The woman who had entered the classroom determined to put Marcus in his place was now forced to confront the reality that she had been completely wrong about him. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice carrying across the silent classroom, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." Marcus nodded, his expression serious but open. "Of course, Professor. How long have you really been working with engines? Because what you just demonstrated isn't the knowledge of someone who's been casually helping in a garage. That was the diagnostic skill of a master mechanic." The question hung in the air, and Marcus could feel his classmates' eyes on him as they waited for his answer. He had been understated about his background, not out of false modesty but because he had learned that people often dismissed his experience when they learned how extensive it really was. "I've been working on engines since I was 8 years old," Marcus said quietly. "But not just helping out, really working. My uncle Jerome owns Johnson's Auto Repair, and he's been teaching me everything he knows since I was old enough to hold a wrench properly." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes wide with interest. "What kind of work have you been doing?" Marcus's voice grew stronger as he talked about something he was passionate about. "Everything. Diagnostics, rebuilds, modifications, troubleshooting problems that other shops couldn't solve. Uncle Jerome specializes in difficult cases, the cars that have been to 3 other mechanics and still don't run right." "That's incredible," Emma said, her voice filled with admiration. "But how did you learn so much so young?" Marcus smiled, and for the first time since entering the classroom 3 days ago, he looked completely relaxed and confident. "Uncle Jerome has a saying, the engine doesn't care how old you are. It just cares whether you understand it. He taught me to listen to what the machine was telling me, to look beyond the obvious, and to never assume that something couldn't be fixed." Professor Richardson's expression was shifting from embarrassment to genuine curiosity. "But surely you've had formal training as well? The way you explained the cavitation problem, the technical terminology you used, that's not just garage knowledge." "You're right," Marcus replied. "I've been taking online engineering courses since I was 10. MIT OpenCourseWare, Khan Academy, technical forums where professional mechanics and engineers share knowledge. I read everything I can get my hands on, textbooks, technical manuals, research papers." Jake shook his head in amazement. "So you've been combining theoretical study with hands-on experience for years. No wonder you could solve that problem so quickly." "But there's more," Marcus continued, his voice taking on a note of pride. "Uncle Jerome isn't just a mechanic, he's an innovator. He holds 3 patents for engine modifications he developed. He taught me that the best solutions come from understanding both the theory and the reality of how things actually work." Professor Richardson sat down heavily in her chair, the full weight of her misjudgment becoming clear. "Mr. Johnson, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you a complete acknowledgement of my prejudice and ignorance. I looked at your age and your background and made assumptions that were not only wrong but harmful." "Professor," Marcus said gently, "I understand why you reacted the way you did. I know I don't look like a typical engineering student. But I hope this shows that knowledge and ability can come from unexpected places." The engine continued its smooth operation in the background, serving as a constant reminder of Marcus's achievement. 25 minutes had passed since he had added the molybdenum disulfide additive, and the engine showed no signs of the seizure problems that had plagued it for months. "Mr. Johnson," Professor Richardson said, her voice stronger now, "I want to make you an offer. I promise to recommend you for graduate-level courses, but I think we can do better than that." Marcus raised his eyebrows, curious about what she had in mind. "I want you to be my teaching assistant," she continued. "I want you to help me redesign this course to better integrate theoretical knowledge with practical application. Your approach to problem solving is exactly what our students need to learn." The offer sent a ripple of excitement through the classroom. Several students exchanged glances, clearly impressed that their professor was not only acknowledging Marcus's abilities but actively seeking to learn from him. "I'd be honored," Marcus replied, his voice filled with genuine appreciation. "But I have one condition." Professor Richardson looked surprised. "What's that?" Marcus's expression became serious. "I want to bring my uncle in as a guest lecturer. He has knowledge and insights that could benefit all of us, but he's never been given the opportunity to share them in an academic setting." Professor Richardson smiled, the first genuine, warm smile Marcus had seen from her. "I think that's an excellent idea. Our students could benefit enormously from his experience." Sarah clapped her hands together, her excitement bubbling over. "This is amazing. Marcus, you've not only solved the engine problem, but you're going to help all of us become better engineers." 26 minutes and still running perfectly, David announced, his voice filled with continuing amazement at the engine's smooth operation. Marcus looked around the classroom at his classmates' faces, seeing genuine respect and admiration where there had once been skepticism and doubt. But more than that, he saw curiosity and eagerness to learn, exactly the attitude that made great engineers. "There's something else I want you all to understand," Marcus said, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher addressing interested students. "What happened here today wasn't about proving that practical knowledge is better than theoretical knowledge, or vice versa. It was about showing that both are necessary for true understanding." He moved closer to the engine, his hand resting on its smooth-running surface. "This engine taught me something important. The graduate students who worked on it before were incredibly smart and knowledgeable. Their theoretical analysis was correct, their calculations were accurate, and their approach was methodical. Then why couldn't they solve it?" Jake asked, genuinely curious. "Because sometimes you need to step outside the framework of what you expect to find," Marcus replied. "They were looking for complex, sophisticated problems because this is a complex, sophisticated engine. But the actual problem was simple, just not obvious." Professor Richardson nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "So the lesson isn't that practical knowledge trumps theoretical knowledge, it's that both perspectives are necessary for complete understanding." "Exactly," Marcus said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "The best engineers are the ones who can think both theoretically and practically, who can combine book learning with real-world experience, and who never stop being curious about how things actually work." The engine continued its steady operation, now approaching 30 minutes of flawless performance. It had become more than just a machine, it was a symbol of what could be achieved when different types of knowledge worked together. Professor Richardson stood up, her posture straighter and her expression more confident than it had been since Marcus had first entered her classroom. "Class, I want you to remember this day. You've witnessed something remarkable, not just a brilliant diagnosis and solution, but a demonstration of how we can learn from each other regardless of age, background, or traditional credentials." She looked directly at Marcus, her voice filled with genuine respect. "Mr. Johnson, you've taught me more in the past hour than I've learned in years. Thank you for your patience with my ignorance, and thank you for showing us a better way to approach engineering problems." Marcus smiled, accepting the acknowledgement with the grace and maturity that had characterized his entire approach to the challenge. "Thank you, Professor Richardson. I'm looking forward to working with you and learning from you as well." As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, students began gathering their materials and preparing to leave. But the atmosphere was completely different from the tension-filled environment that had existed just an hour earlier. Now there was excitement, curiosity, and a sense that they had all been part of something special. 30 minutes and still running perfectly, Sarah announced one final time, her voice filled with pride and satisfaction. The revelation was complete. Marcus Johnson had proven himself not just as a brilliant problem solver, but as a teacher, a bridge builder, and a young person who could change minds and open possibilities that none of them had imagined when the day began. The next morning, Marcus arrived at classroom 304 to find it transformed. Word of his remarkable achievement had spread throughout the engineering department, and the classroom was buzzing with an energy that hadn't existed before. Students who had never spoken to him were eager to introduce themselves, and even faculty members from other departments had stopped by to meet the 12-year-old who had solved the impossible engine problem. Professor Richardson stood at the front of the classroom, but her demeanor was completely different from the previous days. Gone was the cold, dismissive attitude that had characterized her interactions with Marcus. In its place was a warmth and respect that seemed to energize the entire room. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice carrying a note of excitement that her students had rarely heard before. "Before we begin today's lesson, I want to address what happened yesterday and what it means for our class going forward." She looked directly at Marcus, her expression filled with genuine admiration. Mr. Johnson's demonstration yesterday wasn't just a remarkable feat of problem solving, it was a lesson in the importance of keeping an open mind and recognizing that expertise can come from unexpected sources. The other students nodded in agreement, their faces showing the same respect and admiration that had characterized their reactions the day before. But there was something else now, genuine curiosity about learning from Marcus and incorporating his approach into their own studies. Therefore, Professor Richardson continued, "I'm announcing some changes to our curriculum. We're going to incorporate more hands-on problem solving, more real-world applications, and more integration between theoretical knowledge and practical experience." Sarah raised her hand, her voice filled with excitement. "Professor Richardson, does this mean we'll get to work on actual engines like Marcus did yesterday?" "That's exactly what it means," the professor replied with a smile. "Mr. Johnson has agreed to serve as my teaching assistant, and he'll be helping all of you develop the kind of diagnostic thinking that enabled him to solve yesterday's problem." The announcement sent a wave of excitement through the classroom. Students who had been skeptical of Marcus just days before were now eager to learn from him, recognizing that his knowledge and approach could help them become better engineers. Furthermore, Professor Richardson continued, "Mr. Johnson's uncle, Jerome Johnson, will be joining us as a guest lecturer next week. He's a master mechanic with over 30 years of experience and 3 patents for engine innovations. I think you'll find his perspective invaluable." Marcus felt a surge of pride and gratitude. Not only had Professor Richardson kept her promise to acknowledge the value of practical experience, but she was actively working to integrate it into the curriculum in a meaningful way. "Marcus," Jake said, turning to face him directly, "I want to apologize again for my attitude when you first joined the class. I was wrong to judge you based on your age and background." "No apology needed," Marcus replied graciously. "I understand why you were skeptical. But I hope we can work together now to help everyone in the class become better problem solvers." Emma leaned forward, her voice filled with curiosity. "Marcus, can you teach us that diagnostic approach you used yesterday? The way you systematically eliminated possibilities and focused on the most likely causes?" Marcus nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely. It's not complicated, but it does require practice and patience. The key is learning to listen to what the machine is telling you and not letting your assumptions limit your thinking." Professor Richardson watched the interaction with growing satisfaction. The hostile, tension-filled atmosphere that had characterized the class just days before had been replaced by genuine enthusiasm for learning and collaboration. "There's something else I want to announce," she said, calling for everyone's attention. "The department has decided to nominate Mr. Johnson for the Outstanding Student Achievement Award. His demonstration yesterday exemplifies exactly the kind of innovative thinking and problem-solving ability that we want to encourage." The classroom erupted in applause, with students cheering and congratulating Marcus on the recognition. But perhaps more meaningful than the formal award was the genuine respect and admiration he saw in his classmates' faces. "Professor Richardson," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the applause, "I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity, even if it didn't start out the way either of us expected." Professor Richardson's expression grew serious. "Mr. Johnson, I need to be completely honest with you and with the class. I issued that challenge yesterday not to test your abilities fairly, but to humiliate you and prove that you didn't belong here." The classroom fell silent, students looking shocked by the professor's candid admission. "I was wrong," she continued, her voice strong and clear. "I let my prejudices and assumptions cloud my judgment, and I nearly missed the opportunity to learn from one of the most talented young engineers I've ever encountered." Marcus looked at her with an expression of understanding and forgiveness. "Professor, what matters isn't how this started, but how it's ending. You've shown that you can change your mind when presented with evidence, and that's one of the most important qualities an engineer can have." David raised his hand, his voice thoughtful. "Professor Richardson, this whole experience has made me think about my own assumptions. How many other times have we dismissed someone's ideas because they didn't fit our expectations?" "That's exactly the right question to ask," Professor Richardson replied. "One of the most important lessons we can learn as engineers is that good ideas can come from anywhere, and our job is to evaluate them based on their merit, not on their source." Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "It's like Marcus said yesterday, knowledge doesn't have to come from just one source. The best solutions often come from combining different perspectives and types of experience." As the discussion continued, Marcus found himself feeling something he hadn't experienced since entering the classroom, a sense of belonging. He was no longer the outsider trying to prove himself, he was a valued member of a learning community where his knowledge and perspective were not just accepted but actively sought out. "Mr. Johnson," Professor Richardson said, "I'd like you to lead tomorrow's class discussion on diagnostic methodology. I think your classmates would benefit from understanding your systematic approach to problem solving." Marcus nodded, honored by the responsibility. "I'd be happy to. But I'd like to structure it as a collaborative discussion rather than a lecture. Everyone here has knowledge and insights that could contribute to the conversation." The comment exemplified Marcus's approach throughout the entire experience, confident in his abilities but humble about his place in the larger community of learners. He had proven himself without diminishing others, and he had earned respect through competence rather than confrontation. As the class period continued, the atmosphere remained positive and collaborative. Students asked Marcus questions about his background, his learning process, and his approach to problem solving. In return, Marcus showed genuine interest in their perspectives and experiences, recognizing that he too could learn from his classmates. Professor Richardson watched the interactions with growing satisfaction. The change in classroom dynamics was remarkable, from a place of hierarchy and competition to one of collaboration and mutual respect. Marcus's presence hadn't just solved an engine problem, it had transformed the entire learning environment. "Before we end today's class," Professor Richardson announced, "I want to share one more thing. The Dean has asked Mr. Johnson to present his diagnostic methodology to the entire engineering faculty next month. His approach is being considered for integration into multiple courses throughout the department." The announcement was met with another round of applause, but Marcus seemed almost overwhelmed by the recognition. Just a week ago, he had been dismissed as a child who didn't belong in an advanced engineering class. Now he was being asked to teach faculty members. "Marcus," Emma said after class as students were gathering their materials, "you've changed everything here. Not just for yourself, but for all of us." Marcus smiled, looking around at the faces of classmates who had become friends and collaborators. "I think we've all changed each other. That's what happens when people are willing to look beyond their assumptions and really listen to each other." As Marcus packed his materials and prepared to leave, Professor Richardson approached him. "Mr. Johnson, I want you to know that you've taught me more than just engineering in the past few days. You've taught me about humility, about the danger of prejudice, and about the importance of keeping an open mind." Marcus looked at her with genuine appreciation. "Thank you, Professor Richardson. I'm looking forward to working with you and learning from you as well." As they left the classroom together, the experimental engine sat silent in a corner, its successful operation having served its purpose. It had been the stage for Marcus's triumph, but more importantly, it had been the catalyst for a transformation that would benefit everyone in the program. The 12-year-old who had entered classroom 304 as an unwelcome outsider was leaving as a respected colleague, a valued teacher, and a young person who had proven that talent, determination, and knowledge could overcome. Dear Fiend, this story reminds us that brilliance knows no age, race, or background. Every day, talented individuals face judgment based on appearances rather than abilities. Marcus's journey teaches us that when we look beyond our assumptions and give everyone a fair chance to shine, we discover extraordinary potential in unexpected places. True wisdom comes from recognizing that knowledge flows from many sources, and the greatest achievements happen when we combine different perspectives with open hearts and minds. Let Marcus's courage inspire you to stand up for what's right, believe in your abilities, and never let anyone convince you that you don't belong where your talents can flourish. If this story moved you and reminded you to see beyond first impressions, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that celebrate the power of determination, respect, and human potential.